Some dogs don't bark at strangers, they bark at secrets. The town of Birch Hollow had been quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that settled deep into the wood grain of old porches and lingered in the cool air rolling off the lake. And Ethan Cole had almost believed, for the first time in a long while, that silence could mean peace, not warning. But Ranger knew better. He always did. The 6-year-old German Shepherd moved beside him with that steady, deliberate pace of a dog who had once been trained to listen beyond what people could hear, his ears catching things carried on the wind, his nose reading stories left behind in dust and rain. And when they stepped onto Martha Hale's narrow wooden porch, the boards creaking softly under Ethan's worn boots, Ranger paused, just for a second, like something invisible had crossed his path. Martha's house stood at the edge of town, tucked between tall birch trees that whispered even when the air seemed still. The paint on the siding had long since faded to a tired gray, and the windows held that dim, watchful look of a place that had seen more years than visitors. Ethan had come to fix a sagging section of her roof. Nothing more, just another quiet job to pass the time, to keep his hands busy so his mind didn't drift back to places he'd rather forget. Martha had greeted him with a gentle smile and a voice softened by years of living alone, offering coffee and pointing out the trouble spots like it mattered more than it probably did. But Ranger hadn't relaxed, not fully. He moved through the house slowly, nails tapping against the wooden floor, stopping now and then to sniff at corners where shadows seemed a little too thick, like the house itself was holding its breath. Ethan noticed it but said nothing. He had learned a long time ago that when Ranger paid attention, it was best to do the same. The wind shifted outside, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and something metallic, subtle enough that most people would miss it. But Ranger's head lifted slightly, ears angling forward, his body tightening just enough to be noticed if you knew what to look for. Ethan followed his gaze toward the front of the house, just as a car door shut somewhere. Beyond the trees, a clean, deliberate sound that cut through the quiet like a line drawn across still water. Martha glanced toward the window, her expression flickering with something unreadable before she forced a small smile. "That'll be the officer," she said, her voice steady but just a touch too quick, and Ethan felt it then. Not fear exactly, but the kind of awareness that comes before something changes. Ranger stepped toward the door, slow at first, then stopped again, completely still. Now, his eyes fixed ahead, waiting, listening, as if the air itself had started to speak. And in that moment, Ethan realized something he couldn't quite explain. The job, the house, even the quiet town, none of it was as simple as it had seemed. And whatever Ranger was hearing, it wasn't finished yet. The screen door creaked open with a soft, familiar sound, and Officer Daniel Reeves stepped inside with an easy smile that seemed practiced, the kind that settled quickly into place but never quite reached his eyes. His uniform was clean, pressed, the badge catching a thin strip of morning light, as if it had something to prove. And for a moment, everything felt ordinary, the way it always does right before it is not. Martha greeted him with a quiet nod, her hands folded together as though she had been waiting longer than she let on. "Just a routine check," Reeves said, his voice calm, steady, almost gentle, and Ethan gave a small nod in return, saying nothing, watching instead, because that was what he had learned to do. Watch first, speak later. But Ranger did not move. He stood a few feet ahead, body low, ears forward, attention running through him like a wire pulled too tight. Then came the sound, sharp and sudden, a bark that cut clean through the room, not loud for attention, but precise, intentional, the kind of bark that carried meaning. And it came again and again, each one directed at Reeves, never wavering, never unsure. The officer paused mid-step, the smile flickering for just a fraction of a second before returning. "He does not seem to like me much," Reeves said lightly, but his hand adjusted his belt just a little too quickly, and Ethan noticed that the small things always mattered more than the big ones. "He does not usually act like this," Ethan replied, his voice low, steady, though his eyes stayed on the dog, not the man, because Ranger was not confused. He was certain. The air in the room shifted, subtle but real, like a window had opened somewhere no one could see. Martha took a small step back, her gaze moving between them, something unspoken settling in her expression, and Ranger let out a low growl now, not aggressive, not uncontrolled, but deliberate, like a warning given only once. Reeves chuckled softly, brushing it off as if it meant nothing, stepping further into the house, his boots pressing into the worn wood floor. And that was when Ethan saw it, just a trace, barely there, dried along the edge of the sole, a thin line of dark earth that did not belong to the front yard or the gravel road. It was the same deep, damp soil from behind the house, near the back door where the ground stayed cool and shaded all day. Ethan had noticed it earlier while checking the foundation, a place no visitor would walk through without reason. His chest tightened, not with fear, but with recognition, the kind that forms when separate pieces begin to align on their own. Ranger stepped sideways, placing himself between Reeves and the narrow hallway leading deeper into the house, his body blocking the path without command, without hesitation, and for the first time, Reeves stopped moving altogether. The silence stretched thin, fragile, the kind that could break from a single wrong word. But none came, only the quiet sound of the wind brushing against the birch trees outside. And somewhere in that stillness, Ethan understood something he could not ignore anymore. Ranger was not reacting to who the man was pretending to be, he was reacting to where the man had already been, and whatever had happened in that space behind the house, it had not ended yet. Reeves shifted his weight slightly, just enough to test the space in front of him, but Ranger did not yield, not even an inch, his paws planted firm against the worn boards as if he understood something deeper than command, something older than training. And Ethan stepped forward then, not aggressively, not confrontational, but present, placing himself just behind the dog, close enough to feel the steady rise and fall of Ranger's breath. "He is just being cautious," Ethan said quietly, though. The words felt thinner than the moment deserved. Reeves gave a small nod, his eyes drifting briefly toward the hallway, then back again, calculating, measuring. "Cautious is good," he replied, "especially out here." And there was something in the way he said it, not wrong, but not right either, like a sentence that carried more than it showed. Martha cleared her throat softly, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "Officer, I mentioned things have been moving," she said, her voice hesitant now, less certain than before. Reeves turned to her with practiced concern, the kind that came easily to someone used to being believed. "Yes, ma'am. You said some items were out of place." He stepped further inside, carefully, deliberately, choosing a path that kept distance from the dog, his gaze scanning the room, but not in the way Ethan expected, not wide, not searching, but specific, landing on the corners, the shelves, the small details that most people would overlook, as if he already knew what should be there and what should not. Ethan followed that gaze, noticing how it paused, just for a fraction of a second, on the old cabinet near the back wall, the one Martha had not mentioned, the one Ranger had sniffed earlier with unusual focus. The air felt heavier now, thicker, like the house itself was holding on to something it had not yet decided to reveal. Ranger's growl softened but did not disappear. It settled low in his chest, steady, controlled, a constant reminder that whatever had triggered him had not gone away. Reeves walked slowly toward the center of the room, his boots quiet against the floor, but Ethan could still see it, that same dark soil along the edges, dried but unmistakable. And then something else caught his attention, a faint line of dust disturbed near the baseboard along the hallway, subtle, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. It traced a path toward the back of the house, toward the door that led outside, toward the ground that no visitor should have reason to cross. Ethan felt the pieces shift again, not fully formed, but moving, aligning. Ranger suddenly stepped back, just one step, then turned his head slightly, glancing toward Ethan before returning his focus to Reeves, a silent signal, not fear, not retreat, but direction, as if to say the answer was not in front of them, but somewhere just beyond. Martha noticed it too, her eyes narrowing slightly. "He keeps doing that," she whispered, almost to herself, and for a brief moment, the room fell into a kind of stillness that felt intentional, like a pause waiting to be understood. Reeves straightened, smoothing his sleeve with a small, absent motion. "I can take a look around the property," he offered, his tone steady, helpful, the kind of offer that should have brought relief, but did not, because now Ethan knew something he had not known before. Ranger was not reacting to a stranger entering the house. He was reacting to someone who had already been inside, already walked those boards, already stood in that silence when no one else was there. And as the wind brushed softly against the birch trees outside, Ethan realized the truth was not hiding. It was waiting, just out of sight, in the places people rarely checked twice. Reeves stepped back onto the porch with that same measured calm, the screen door easing shut behind him with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have been. And for a moment no one moved. Not Ethan, not Martha, not even the wind. As if the house itself was waiting to see what would happen next, Ranger remained still at the threshold, eyes fixed through the glass, tracking the officer's every step as he moved across the yard, his boots pressing into the gravel, then veering slightly. Off the path, not toward the road where he had come from, but toward the side of the house where the birch trees grew thicker and the ground stayed cool and damp even in daylight. Ethan felt it then, a quiet certainty settling into place, not loud, not sudden, but steady, like a memory returning piece by piece. He is not checking the property, Ethan said softly, more to himself than anyone else, and Martha followed his gaze, her breath catching just enough to be heard. That is not where people go when they are leaving, she whispered, her voice thinner now. Carrying something closer to truth than fear, Ranger let out a low sound, almost a hum, then turned his head slightly toward Ethan again. That same silent signal, and this time Ethan did not hesitate. He moved, stepping out onto the porch, the wood cool beneath his boots, the air carrying the faint scent of wet leaves and something older, something that had been disturbed and never quite settled back into place. He did not call out, did not announce himself. He simply walked, following the line Ranger had already drawn, around the side of the house where the grass thinned into patches of dark soil. And there it was again, clearer now in the open light, the same deep earth clinging to the ground in uneven shapes, marked by footprints that did not belong to Martha. Not to any visitor who stayed on the front path. They led toward the back door, but not directly. They curved, as if the person who made them knew exactly where to step and where to avoid, like someone who had been there before. Many times, Ranger moved ahead, nose low, tracing the path with quiet precision, stopping at the edge of the back steps, his ears lifting, his body still once more. The back door stood closed, its paint slightly worn along the handle, and Ethan noticed something else. Now, a faint line where the dust had been disturbed just above the latch, too high for accident, too clean to ignore. Martha came to stand just behind him, her hand resting lightly against the doorframe. "I lock that every night," she said, not defensive, not uncertain, just stating a truth that had always been enough until now. Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes moving from the handle to the ground, to the trees beyond, and then back again. The pieces were no longer scattered, they were forming. Something solid, something that could not be dismissed as coincidence or imagination. Ranger placed one paw gently against the bottom of the door, not scratching, not pushing, just resting there as if marking the place. And for a brief second, everything felt aligned in a way Ethan could not ignore. The bark, the soil, the path, the silence, it all pointed to the same conclusion. But conclusions required proof, and proof required patience. He stepped back then, not opening the door, not yet, because whatever waited behind it had not been meant to be found so easily. And as the wind shifted again through the birch trees, carrying that same faint metallic edge, Ethan realized something that settled deep in his chest. This was not about something that might happen. It was about something that already had, something hidden in plain sight, waiting for the one moment when someone would finally see it for what it was. The door did not open right away, not because it could not, but because something about it felt like it should not, and Ethan stood there for a long second, his hand hovering just inches from the handle, as if the wood itself might answer if he waited long enough. Ranger remained still beside him, that same quiet intensity in his posture, no urgency, no panic, just certainty, the kind that does not need to rush because it already knows. Martha shifted slightly behind them, her voice softer now, almost careful. "It has never stuck before," she said, though Ethan had not even tried the latch yet. And that was what made him move, slowly, deliberately, his fingers closing around the handle, the metal cool and smooth. And when he pressed down, it gave with almost no resistance at all, easier than it should have, Easier than a door that had been locked every night for years, it opened inward with a low, tired creak, revealing a narrow stretch of worn wooden steps leading down to the shaded ground behind the house. The air that drifted in was different, cooler, carrying that same faint metallic scent, but stronger now, mixed with damp soil and something else, something that lingered like a memory that refused to fade. Ranger stepped forward first, not rushing, placing each paw with careful precision as if following a path only he could see, his nose tracing the edge of the doorway. Then the first step, then the second. Ethan followed, his eyes adjusting to the shift in light as the trees above filtered the sun into thin, scattered beams that barely touched the ground. And there it was again, clearer now than before. The footprints, deeper here, more defined, pressed into the soft earth in a pattern that repeated, back and forth, not random, not wandering, but purposeful, like someone who had come here more than once, who knew exactly where to stand and where not to. Ethan crouched slightly, studying the marks, the size, the spacing, the angle of the heel, details that spoke quietly but clearly if you knew how to listen. And he did. Years of training had taught him that the smallest signs often carried the heaviest truths. Ranger stopped. A few feet ahead, his body lowering just enough to signal that something was close, his head tilting slightly toward a section of ground near the base of the house, where the soil looked subtly different, not freshly disturbed, not obvious, but just enough to break the natural pattern of leaves and dirt. Ethan moved closer, brushing aside a thin layer of fallen leaves with the side of his boot, revealing a faint outline beneath, not a hole, not exactly, but a space, something covered, something placed there with intention. Martha stepped down carefully behind him, her breath catching as she looked. That was not there, she said, not in disbelief, but in quiet recognition that something she had trusted had changed without her knowing. Ethan knelt now, his hand hovering just above the surface, feeling the slight difference in temperature, the subtle give of the ground that should have been firm. Ranger let out a soft exhale, almost like a sigh, as if the answer they had been circling was finally within reach. And in that moment, everything connected. The bark, the officer, the path, the door, it all led here, not to something imagined, not to a feeling or a suspicion, but to something real, something placed beneath their feet, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone who knew how to listen. And as Ethan slowly reached forward, he understood that whatever lay beneath that thin layer of earth had not been meant to stay hidden forever, only until the right moment came. And that moment had arrived without warning, carried in on 4 steady paws and a silence that refused to be ignored. The earth gave way easier than expected, not loose, not freshly turned, but softened just enough to reveal that it had been opened and closed more than once. And Ethan brushed the top layer aside with steady, careful movements, uncovering the edge of something flat beneath the soil, not wood, not stone, but metal, worn and dulled by time, yet still intact. A small hatch no wider than 2 feet across, set into the ground so precisely it could disappear under a handful of leaves. Martha stepped back slightly, her hand rising to her chest as if her body recognized the weight of the moment before her mind could. I have lived here 23 years, she said quietly, her voice trembling just enough to carry truth, and I have never seen that. Ranger moved closer, lowering his head until his nose hovered just above the metal surface, inhaling slowly, then exhaling in a soft, controlled breath, not alarmed, not uncertain, but focused, as if confirming something he had already known from the beginning. Ethan ran his fingers along the edge of the hatch, feeling the faint groove where it met the surrounding soil, noticing the small scratches near one corner, marks left by something sharp, something used repeatedly but carefully. This was not forgotten, this was maintained, and that realization settled deep, heavier than any object they might find beneath it. He looked back toward the house, toward the line of trees, toward the path where the footprints had curved with quiet intention, and then back again. Everything still pointed in one direction, not random, not accidental, but deliberate. Someone has been coming here, Ethan said, his voice low, steady, carrying no panic, only certainty. Martha nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the hatch as if it might move on its own if she looked away. But for what? She whispered, and the question lingered in the air. unanswered but no longer abstract. Ethan reached for the edge of the metal, testing it gently. It did not resist. Instead, it lifted with a soft, hollow sound, revealing a narrow space beneath, dark at first, then gradually shaped by the light filtering through the trees. Inside was not chaos, not emptiness, but order, a small compartment lined with weathered boards, just deep enough to hold a few carefully placed items, a canvas pouch, folded and tied, a stack of papers sealed in a clear covering, and something else, a small, rectangular device with a dull black surface, its edges worn from use, not abandoned, not forgotten, but handled again and again. Ranger leaned in slightly, his ears shifting, listening, not to sound, but to presence. Ethan did not reach in immediately. Instead, he studied the arrangement, the way everything had been placed with care, not hidden in haste, but stored with purpose, and that told him more than anything else could. This was not about taking something. It was about keeping something close, something important enough to return for. Martha took a slow breath, her voice barely above the wind. "That does not belong to me," she said, and Ethan nodded, because he already knew that, just as he knew something else now, something that had been forming since the first bark on the porch. The officer had not been checking on her safety. He had been checking on this, making sure it was still here, still hidden, still his. And as the quiet settled once more around them, broken only by the soft rustle of leaves and the steady breath of the dog who had seen it first, Ethan understood that whatever lay inside that small space was not just evidence of a secret, it was the reason the secret existed at all. And somewhere beyond the trees, a car door echoed faintly in the distance, as if someone had not gone very far after all. The sound came again, faint but unmistakable, a car door closing somewhere beyond the line of trees, not far, not distant, but close enough to belong to the same moment. And Ethan did not look up right away. He did not rush, because rushing was how people miss things. Instead, he reached slowly into the compartment, lifting the canvas pouch first, its fabric worn but clean, tied with a simple knot that had been opened and retied many times. Inside were small items, nothing flashy, nothing valuable in the way most people would measure it, but each one carried weight. A set of keys labeled with faded tags, a folded photograph of an older couple standing in front of a house that looked familiar, and a small notebook filled with tight, careful handwriting, names, dates, addresses, lines drawn between them like a map that only one person fully understood. Martha leaned closer, her breath shallow now, her eyes scanning the page without fully grasping what she was seeing. "Those are people from around here," she said quietly, recognizing faces, places, fragments of a community she had lived beside for decades. Ethan set the notebook aside and picked up the sealed stack of papers next, sliding one free just enough to read the heading. Official documents, property records, transfers, signatures, all legitimate on the surface, but the dates told a different story. Too many changes, too close together, land passing from one name to another until it disappeared into something harder to trace, something that did not want to be followed. Ranger shifted slightly behind him, his attention no longer fixed on the hatch, but on the trees beyond, his ears lifting, his body angling toward a direction Ethan had not yet turned to face. And that was when Ethan felt it. Not fear, not urgency, but presence, the sense that they were no longer alone in this discovery, that someone else already knew they had found it. He placed the papers back carefully, not hiding them, not yet, just returning them to the space where they had been kept. Because this was no longer just about what was inside the hatch. It was about who needed it to stay. There, the small black device remained, untouched until now. And when Ethan finally picked it up, it felt heavier than its size suggested, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented, a tool, something used, something returned to again and again. Its surface bore faint marks, not damage, but use, deliberate and repeated. Martha stepped back another inch, her voice barely more than breath. "That does not belong here," she said, and Ethan understood what she meant. It did not belong to the house, or to her, or to anything that had been built with trust. It belonged to something else entirely, something that worked quietly, carefully, without drawing attention. Ranger let out a low, steady sound, not a growl, not a warning, but something in between, And this time Ethan followed his gaze, lifting his head toward the trees just as a faint movement shifted between the trunks, subtle, almost invisible, but enough. Enough to confirm what he already knew. Whoever had been coming here had not left as far as they wanted them to believe. And as the wind moved again through the birch leaves, carrying that same thin edge of metal and earth, Ethan closed the hatch halfway, not sealing it, not exposing it, just leaving it as it was meant to appear, because sometimes the only way to see the truth fully was to let it think it was still hidden. And in that quiet space between discovery and action, he realized something that settled deep and certain. This was no longer about finding what had been buried. It was about waiting for the one who had buried it to come back. The hatch rested half-closed, just as Ethan had left it, a quiet illusion of untouched ground that might fool anyone who was not looking closely. And he stepped back slowly, brushing a thin layer of leaves over the edge without disturbing the pattern too much, not hiding it, just returning it to what it had been meant to appear. Ranger stayed close, his body angled toward the trees, every sense tuned to something beyond sight. And Martha stood a few steps behind them, her hands clasped together now, not in fear, but in the kind of quiet waiting that comes when a truth is no longer avoidable. The air felt different, heavier, like the space itself had shifted from discovery to anticipation. Ethan moved back toward the house without a word, each step measured, each movement deliberate, and Ranger followed, though his head turned once more toward the trees as if marking the place in memory. Inside, the house felt smaller somehow, not physically, but in the way silence can shrink a space when it carries too much meaning. Ethan closed the back door gently, making sure the latch settled into place the way Martha expected it to, restoring the surface of normalcy that had been broken only minutes before. "We do not say anything yet," he said quietly, his voice steady, not commanding, just certain. Martha nodded, understanding without needing explanation, because whatever had been hidden outside was not just something to be found. It was something to be watched. Ranger moved toward the front of the house now, his pace slower, but his focus unchanged, stopping near the window that faced the gravel drive, his ears lifting slightly. Listening, waiting. Ethan joined him there, standing just off to the side so his reflection would not show, his eyes tracing the line of the road, the curve of the trees, the space where the car had been moments ago. Time stretched in that quiet way it does when something is about to happen, but has not yet revealed itself. The wind brushed softly against the glass, carrying with it that same faint metallic scent, thinner now, but still present. And then it came, not a sound at first, but a shift, a subtle movement between the trees, a shadow where there should not have been one, still for a moment, then gone, and Ranger's body tightened instantly, not reacting with noise this time, but with stillness, deeper, more focused, as if the game had changed, as if the warning had already been given and now something else was required. Ethan did not move, did not step forward. He simply watched, because watching was what allowed truth to reveal itself without interference. And after a long moment, the sound returned, clearer now, footsteps against soft ground, slow, careful, measured, not approaching the front, but circling, just out of sight, just beyond the edge of what could be seen from the window. Martha's breath caught softly behind him, but she did not speak. She understood now that silence mattered, that sound would change whatever was unfolding outside. Ranger lowered his head slightly, his eyes fixed on a point Ethan could not yet see. And in that quiet, suspended moment, Ethan realized that whoever had come back was not here to check. Not this time. They were here because something had changed, because something they believed was still hidden had been touched. And as the wind stilled completely, as the house seemed to hold its breath once more, Ethan understood that the next step would not be about finding the truth. It would be about facing the one who had been trying to keep it buried. The footsteps did not rush. They did not hesitate. They moved with the quiet confidence of someone who believed the ground still belonged to them. And Ethan stood still by the window, not hiding, not revealing himself, simply present in the moment as it unfolded. Ranger remained at his side, his body steady, his breathing slow, the kind of calm that only comes after certainty has replaced doubt. The shadow moved again between the birch trees, closer now, no longer careful enough to disappear completely. And then he stepped into view, Officer Daniel Reeves, no longer framed by the open road or the polite distance of a front porch, but standing within the edges of something he had tried to keep unseen, his uniform still neat, his expression still controlled, but there was a weight in his posture now, something heavier than before, as if the silence itself had begun to press back against him. He looked toward the house, not surprised, not confused, but aware, and that awareness said more than any denial ever could. Ethan opened the door slowly, not with force, not with challenge, just enough for the air between them to carry the truth without words. Reeves did not reach for anything, did not step forward. He simply stopped, his eyes shifting once, briefly, toward the side of the house where the hatch lay hidden beneath leaves, and that single glance was enough to confirm everything Ranger had already known, enough to close the space between suspicion and certainty. Martha stepped into the doorway behind Ethan, her presence quiet but steady, no longer uncertain, no longer questioning, just witnessing. And in that moment the house, the trees, the ground beneath them all seemed to settle into a kind of stillness that did not belong to fear, but to clarity. Reeves exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just enough to reveal the truth he could no longer hold in place. Not spoken, not explained, but understood. Ethan did not accuse him, did not raise his voice, because some truths did not need to be forced into the open. They revealed themselves when there was nowhere left to hide. Ranger took one step forward, then stopped, his gaze steady, no longer warning, no longer searching, but resolved, as if the purpose he had carried since the first bark had finally reached its end. The wind moved softly through the trees again, lighter now, carrying away the edge that had lingered all morning. And for the first time since Ethan had arrived, the quiet felt different, not heavy, not uncertain, but clear, like something long buried had finally been allowed to breathe. Reeves turned slightly, not in retreat, but in acknowledgement, and without another word, he stepped back toward the trees, toward the path that no longer belonged to him the way it once had. Ethan watched until the movement faded completely, until the space between the trunks returned to stillness, and only then did he close the door, gently, the latch settling into place with a soft, certain sound. Martha exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing in a way they had not before, and Ranger lay down near the threshold, his eyes half closed, his work finished. But as Ethan turned back toward the house, toward the quiet that now felt earned rather than fragile, he noticed something small, almost easy to miss, the faint outline of another disturbed board inside the hallway, a place Ranger had not yet paused, not yet marked. And in that subtle, unfinished detail, Ethan understood that some truths do not end when they are found. They simply lead to the next place where something has been waiting, even longer to be seen.